Moving into a new apartment should be exciting. A fresh start. A new chapter. That's what I told myself when I signed the lease for apartment 305 last year. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small one-bedroom unit in an old brick building. The rent was cheap, the location was perfect, and my neighbors seemed quiet. At least, that's what I thought. At first, everything felt normal. I'd see my neighbors in the hallways, exchange polite nods, and sometimes hear people moving around in their units. The walls were thin, but that was expected in an older building. I didn't mind. I was just happy to have a place of my own. Then I noticed something odd about the guy in apartment 306. I never saw him move in, and I never saw him leave. But I could hear him. It started with the footsteps. Late at night, I would hear shuffling sounds coming from his apartment. It wasn't the normal kind of walking. It was slow, deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth for hours. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a neighbor with insomnia or a strange routine. But then came the whispering. It was faint at first, almost like the hum of a distant radio. But as the nights went on, it grew louder. It wasn't a language I could understand, just low, frantic murmuring, like someone talking to themselves in a panic. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to block it out. But it always found its way into my ears. One evening, I came home from work and noticed something strange. The peephole in apartment 306 was dark, like someone was standing behind it, looking out. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but the feeling stayed with me. A few nights later, it happened again. I was unlocking my door when I heard it, soft breathing, coming from the peephole of apartment 306. My heart skipped a beat. Someone was standing there, just inches away from me, watching me through the peephole. I hurried inside and locked my door. My hands were shaking. I sat on my couch, trying to calm myself down. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I went to the building manager, Mrs. Grayson, and asked about the guy in 306. She gave me a confused look. "There's no one living in 306, she said. I felt my stomach drop. "That's not possible," I said. "I hear him every night. I know someone's there." She hesitated, then leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "The last tenant, he disappeared. Just vanished one night. Left all his belongings behind. We never found him." I stared at her, my mind racing. "What do you mean, vanished?" She shook her head. "I don't know. One day he was here, the next he was gone. The police came, but they didn't find anything. No signs of a struggle, no clues. It was like he just disappeared." That night, I stayed awake, listening. At 1 a.m., the whispering started again. It was louder now, more urgent. I gathered my courage and stepped into the hallway, turning toward 306. My hands were shaking as I leaned in, trying to listen. Then, the peephole darkened. Someone was standing right there, watching me from the other side. I ran back into my apartment and locked the door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I convinced Mrs. Grayson to check 306 with me. She seemed reluctant but agreed. She unlocked the door, and we stepped inside. The apartment was completely empty. No furniture, no signs of life. Just dust and silence. But in the far corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were scratches on the floor, deep marks, as if someone had been pacing back and forth for hours. And near the peephole, long fingernail scratches. I moved out that weekend. I couldn't stay there anymore. The thought of someone, or something, watching me through the peephole was too much to bear. I packed my things and left without looking back. But the worst part? 2 weeks after I left, I got a text message from an unknown number. "Why did you leave? I liked watching you." I never replied. I changed my number. I blocked everything. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear the shuffling footsteps. And when I look at my own peephole, it's always dark. I moved into a new place across town, a modern building with thick walls and security cameras. I thought I was safe. But last night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it, the faint sound of whispering coming from the hallway. I froze. Then, slowly, I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. It was dark. When I moved into my first house, I was thrilled. It wasn't anything huge, just a small, one-story home with a decent backyard. It was in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where people actually smiled at you when you walked by. I had lived in apartments my whole life, so having my own space, my own yard, felt like a dream. The first few weeks were peaceful, but then one night, I heard something outside, a crunching sound, like footsteps on dead leaves. I turned the TV volume down and listened. The steps were slow, deliberate. I peered outside through the back door but saw nothing. The next morning, I found footprints near the tree in the corner of my yard. Shoe prints, not animal prints. A few days later, I noticed my shed door was slightly open. The rusty lock had been broken off. Inside, someone had cleared a space in the back corner. There was a dirty blanket, a half-empty water bottle, and crumpled food wrappers. Someone had been living in my shed. I called my neighbor, Jim, and asked if he had seen anything strange. He sighed. "You ever seen the guy in the backyard?" he asked. "What guy?" I said, my stomach dropping. "Tall, thin man, scruffy beard, wears an old, dirty coat. He used to come around a lot when the old owners lived here. They called the cops a few times, but he always disappeared before they arrived." "Who is he?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jim shook his head. "No one really knows. Some say he's homeless. Others say he used to live in that house a long time ago and never let it go." That night, I barely slept. Every little sound made me jump. I kept imagining that scruffy man standing outside my window, watching me. Then one evening, I saw him. A tall, thin man in a dirty coat, standing just at the edge of my yard, near the tree. He wasn't moving. He wasn't doing anything. He was just watching me. I called the police, but when they arrived, he was gone. The next night at 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of my back door handle jiggling. Someone was trying to get in. I crept toward the door, peering through the small window at the top. He was there, the man in the dirty coat. His face was pressed against the glass, his eyes wide, his breath fogging up the window. I screamed. He ran. The cops came, but again, they found nothing. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I installed motion sensor lights, security cameras, and even a high fence around the yard. But no matter what I did, the man always seemed to find a way in. One morning, while reviewing the security footage, I noticed something strange. The motion sensor had gone off at exactly 3 a.m. as usual. But this time, the footage showed something I couldn't explain. The man wasn't just standing there. He was smiling, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far across his face. And then, as if he knew he was being watched, he turned his head and looked directly into the camera. His eyes were pitch black like voids. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just some homeless man. Something was wrong with him. A few days later, I decided to clean out the basement. The previous owners had left behind a lot of junk, and I figured it was time to sort through it. As I was moving boxes, I found something odd. A small, rusted door hidden behind a stack of old furniture. It was locked, but the key was hanging on a nail nearby. My hands trembled as I unlocked it and pulled the door open. Inside was a tiny room, barely big enough to stand in. The walls were covered in scratches, deep, frantic marks, like someone had been trapped there. In the corner was a pile of old, yellowed newspapers. I picked one up and read the headline, "Local Man Disappears Without a Trace." The article was from 1987. It described a man named Thomas Grayson who had vanished from this very house. His wife claimed he had been acting strange for weeks, talking about someone watching him and whispers in the yard. The police had searched the property but found no evidence of foul play. I felt a knot form in my stomach. The man in the backyard, was he Thomas Grayson? But that would make him over 70 years old. The man I saw didn't look a day over 40. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the scratches on the walls, the newspapers, and the man's black eyes. At 3 a.m., I heard it again, the sound of footsteps in the backyard. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the window. The man was standing there, but this time, he wasn't alone. There were others, shadowy figures, all wearing dirty coats, all staring at the house. I felt a wave of panic. I called the police, but when they arrived, the figures were gone. The officers searched the yard but found nothing. The next day, I decided to dig deeper. I went to the local library and searched through old records. What I found made my blood run cold. The house had been built in the 1920s, and over the years, several people had gone missing. Always at 3 a.m., always after reporting strange occurrences in the backyard. The police had never found any of them. I also found a journal belonging to the original owner of the house. In it, he described a ritual, a way to appease the watchers. According to the journal, the watchers were beings that lived in the shadows, feeding on fear. The only way to stop them was to perform the ritual. I decided to try the ritual. I followed the instructions in the journal, placing candles around the yard and chanting the words written on the page. As I did, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to come alive. The man in the dirty coat appeared, his black eyes fixed on me. But this time, he didn't smile. He looked afraid. The ground beneath me began to shake, and the shadows twisted and writhed. I felt a force pulling at me, trying to drag me into the darkness. I screamed the final words of the ritual, and suddenly, everything stopped. The man was gone. The shadows were gone. I thought it was over. But a few nights later, I woke up to the sound of footsteps again. I looked out the window and saw him, the man in the dirty coat, standing at the edge of the yard. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were dozens of them, all staring at the house, all wearing the same dirty coats. And then I realized the truth. The ritual hadn't stopped them. It had summoned them. Now, every night at 3 a.m., I hear the footsteps. I see the shadows moving in the yard, and I know it's only a matter of time before they come for me. Moving into a new apartment is supposed to be exciting. A fresh start, a new place to call home. When I found a cheap, one-bedroom unit in a quiet neighborhood, I thought I had lucked out. The building was old but well-kept, and my third-floor apartment had a decent view of the street below. The landlord assured me the building was safe, and the neighbors were quiet. It seemed perfect. At first, everything was normal. I unpacked my boxes, arranged my furniture, and settled into my new routine. But about a week after moving in, I noticed something strange. The apartment directly across from mine, on the same floor, had its curtains wide open at all times. Even at night, the lights inside were on, and I could see straight into the unit. It felt odd, but I told myself maybe the tenant just liked natural light. Then I saw him. A man, standing perfectly still in front of the window, staring directly into my apartment. I froze. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared. I closed my blinds, shaking off the unease. But the next night, it happened again. This continued for 3 more nights. I never saw him move. I never saw him sit or walk away. He was just there whenever I happened to look. By the 4th night, I was genuinely disturbed. I decided to ask my landlord about the guy in the apartment across from me. "That apartment?" he said, frowning. "It's been empty for months." I felt my stomach drop. "That's not possible," I said. "I see someone in there every night." He shook his head. "No one has rented that unit since last year. The last tenant left in a hurry. Said she felt like she was being watched." That night, I didn't want to look, but at around 2 a.m., my curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I walked over to my window and lifted the blinds just a crack. He was there. But this time, something was different. He wasn't in the apartment anymore. He was closer, standing on my fire escape, right outside my window. I stumbled backward, my heart slamming in my chest. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear him climb. He had just appeared there. I ran to my bedroom and locked the door. My hands were shaking as I called the police. When they arrived, they searched the fire escape, the building, and even the supposedly empty apartment. Nothing. There were no footprints. No signs of forced entry. The apartment across from me was completely vacant. No furniture, no lights, nothing. The next day, I decided to dig deeper. I went to the local library and searched through old newspapers. What I found made my blood run cold. The building had a history of disappearances. Over the past 20 years, 3 tenants had vanished without a trace, all from the same apartment, the one across from mine. The police had never found any evidence, and the cases remained unsolved. I also found a journal in the library archives written by a former tenant. In it, she described seeing a man in the window of the empty apartment. She wrote about how he would appear at night, staring at her, and how she felt like he was trying to communicate something. The last entry was chilling. "He's not just watching me. He's waiting. I don't know what he wants, but I can't stay here anymore." Desperate for answers, I reached out to a local historian who specialized in urban legends. She told me about an old ritual tied to the building. According to legend, the man in the window was a watcher, a spirit bound to the building, cursed to observe but never interact. The only way to break the curse was to perform a specific ritual involving candles, mirrors, and a chant. I was skeptical, but I had nothing to lose. That night, I followed the instructions. I placed candles around my living room, set up a mirror facing the window, and recited the chant. As I spoke the final words, the air grew colder. The candles flickered, and the mirror began to fog up. I looked into the mirror and saw him, the man in the window. But he wasn't outside anymore. He was in the mirror, and he was smiling. I screamed and backed away, but the mirror shattered, and the candles went out. The room was plunged into darkness. When I turned on the lights, the man was gone. I thought it was over, but the next night, I woke up to a soft tapping sound. I crept to the living room window and pulled the blinds just an inch. A pair of pale hands were pressed against the glass, and behind them, a face. His face. Only this time, he was smiling. I screamed. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. I moved out the next day. But sometimes, when I pass by old apartment buildings, I can't help but glance at the windows. And every once in a while, I see a man standing completely still, staring back at me. A year later, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address, just my name scrawled on the front. Inside was a photograph. It was a picture of my old apartment building, taken from across the street. The window of my former apartment was clearly visible. And there, standing in the window, was me, staring back.